Hi. So now we are about to start talking attention magnets, and I'm really excited for this part because I know this is one of the things that people are looking forward to the most, and it's all about surface design. It's about designing the surface of your game so that it is attractive and so that down the road when you do your marketing and your promotion campaign, it's easier, right? When you are about to create your sales page, when you are about to explain to people, either to investors or potential players, why they should care about your game, you are basically make by designing a strong surface, and attention magnets are one of the main tools for that. By designing a strong surface, you are making your job easier, right? So many people think in terms of feature lists, right? So what are the features that my game has, right? So it has like 40 levels, it has 20 different characters, it has like 40 hours of gameplay and all that. And as developers, we can think that way because we know all of the hard work that goes behind producing each of those things. And we'll talk about being pragmatic in producing games later on. But for now, we definitely want to stay away from this type of phrasing when we are discussing promotion, right? Because it just sounds like amateur marketing, really, right? So no one wants 40 plus levels, right? Who has time, right? We barely have time to play 3 levels. Who wants 40 levels? This is something that the player will only appreciate once he is within the experience and you have already convinced him that it's worth to spend time playing your thing, right? So it's not something that you want to promote necessarily. It's completely different from when CD Projekt announces that the next The Witcher has like 100 plus hours of gameplay because people already know them, they already know what to expect. But we as indies, we are playing a different game here, right? And when we try to emulate that by saying, hey, we have uh, 30 plus things and 40 plus other things and all that, we sound amateur. And actually, this is, having your marketing sounding amateurish is actually an anti-magnet because it will, people feel that it sounds amateur and they will kind of expand the notion that the market is not very good into the notion that the game is also probably not very good, right? And so you are repelling your audience when you communicate with them like that. And there are even indie games that uh, even doing marketing like this have been successful, right? I'm not saying that I'm always against that. It's not that. It's just that this is not the focus. You can have those things, but this is not. It's never the focus of marketing to try to say like 1,000 different things about your game or 50 different things. It's about talking about 2 or 3 really powerful things, right? It's about nailing down and narrowing down to the most powerful parts of your message and then making sure they are well delivered. And then, only then, you can focus on the other things, right? If you want to talk about the amount of levels or anything like that, we'll get into a little bit more details later on. But the core idea here is that you want to focus on 2 or 3 or 4 very powerful things, and that's it. Now, figuring out which are those things, this is the most difficult, but also it's not necessarily difficult, but it's where you should focus your efforts, right? Because this is what will make or break your message, right? And there are some indie games that have bad trailers or sales pages that look like just like what I described it, and in spite of that, they have sold well, right? So remember, we are only seeing the surface of a game's strategy, and we are only seeing the winners, right? Remember survivorship bias. So some games they end up doing well despite of how they do marketing, right? That doesn't mean that you should copy that. So this is a pretty universal thing that applies to marketing in games or movies or anything really. Find out what your customer cares about and what will impress and what will make them really want to play your thing or to buy your thing, and focus on that, right? Make sure you spend a lot of energy into those 2 or 3 points that make a difference for them. And this is what attention magnets is all about. So now we talk about a set of attention magnets that have to do with how you compare yourself against a certain genre or against a certain reference game. And there are actually a few ways to leverage on that for your marketing. So let's talk about that. So here we have these 4 attention magnets. And I want to start talking about the next step in the genre attention magnets, which is sometimes called game X but better, right? This is the first one, and actually I have organized this in a way where sometimes I will be discussing one magnet that is difficult to implement, just to give some sort of idea on which are some of the other possible ways that you can go about doing that, right? right? So sometimes they will create some sort of baseline, and then we will start exploring some alternative ideas. And this is why we have this attention symbol beside here, because this is actually very difficult to pull off. It's not impossible, but it's difficult. Next step in a genre, or game X but better, is basically when you establish a comparison parameter and then you beat it. So for indies, what ends up being far more common is doing game X but worse, right? And this is a very dangerous anti-magnet because you're establishing a comparison parameter and then under-delivering. We already talked about that. It's very dangerous. So you don't want to be in a situation where you say, hey, this game is like Super Meat Boy, but it has less levels and the gameplay is not well fine-tuned and it's not as fun, doesn't have as many secrets. So it's pretty much like Super Meat Boy, but it's not really as good as Super Meat Boy. That's a terrible perspective for marketing, right? And if you don't consider the alternative angles to do your marketing and even to develop your game surface, sometimes through developing the game itself to have that surface, then you are putting yourself in a bad situation, right? So you don't want to do game X but worse, right? And one solution for that is get inspired by one game. If that's Super Meat Boy, it's fine if you do a game like Super Meat Boy, but get inspired by it, even if it's not as good as the original one, but find a different perspective to promote it. Find a different angle, find a different twist, something that will make you not be compared against Super Meat Boy, right? Which will put you in a different category, right? And we'll talk about that in a second. But make sure, either if you are comparing yourself against a genre or through with a game, make sure that you're establishing some sort of comparison parameter that you can either surpass or get rid of that comparison parameter and do something different, right? And this is what the next magnet is about. So this here is something that usually, unless you are very experienced with the genre, I would not recommend trying to aim for this one. This is why this has this caution icon over here, because I know many people start by thinking, okay, I'll make the next RPG, the next platformer, the next step in what people will expect forever from this genre. If you start like that and if you under-deliver, then it's a terrible situation, right? So this is here just as a caution, really. Now, one thing that's far more applicable, far more actionable, is doing a weird step in a genre. Not the next step, but a weird step in a genre, or what we call game X but different. That's more feasible, right? So it's when you establish a comparison parameter and then you do something that's both different and attractive, right? So we could do like Super Mario but with a ninja rope, for example. So you can swing around and this is all about throwing that grappling hook and moving around the levels in a different manner. Okay, you are not Mario anymore. You're not Super Meat Boy anymore. You are the game that is exploring what a game can be like when it relies so heavily on a grappling hook. That's fine. So that's a weird step in the genre. That's game X but different. That's far easier to accomplish, right? So a few examples. A pretty old one, really, but just because we are talking about Mario, Sonic was actually kind of perceived by the market and probably envisioned by the creators as that when they were promoting the game. It's like Mario, but it's faster. It's, the character is cool and he's kind of like you. He's not this silly mustache plumber. It's a super fast hedgehog and it does loopings and it's not really the next step in what Mario was trying to achieve, but it was trying to achieve something different. It was Mario, but really fast, right? So this is an ancient example, but I think it's relevant to discuss. Super Meat Boy, we have also been discussing, is pretty much that in comparison to platformers. And before, at the time when that game was released, the comparison parameter that people had for platformers was something very, very different from Super Meat Boy, right? It's a game where you die over and over. Sometimes you will die every 2 seconds, and it's perceived as super difficult. We'll talk about real difficulty versus perceived difficulty when we discuss a little bit about design, but it's perceived as being very difficult, and your several attempts will leave blood all over the levels. So yeah, it's kind of Super Meat Boy is like platformers, but really difficult and frantic and short levels and all that. So it's a different approach to platformers, right? And these are a few examples. I want to talk about some caveats. First, the different thing that you are trying to implement to change the expectation or the perspective that your game is giving to that genre or that comparison game, it requires iteration, right? So it's much easier to copy Mario and then do more levels than it is to make Mario, but much, much faster, right? Because you need a lot of iteration. So it's definitely a goal that's worth pursuing. Just take in mind that usually it will take more time to get there, right? It will take a little more time to get to fine tune the gameplay or whatever it is that you are considering to be the twist that you are adding to the genre or comparison game. Make sure you know remember you need some time to implement things, right? And iteration usually consumes a lot more time than people estimate, especially when they're trying to deal with innovating in any form, right? So you should definitely be focusing on innovating on certain things, but if you try to innovate everywhere or if you don't account for the time required to iterate, you may end up stuck in a game that will take much longer than planned to finish, right? And that's why it's much easier to do that if you have already worked on game X, right? We're talking about game X, but different. So have you mastered doing game X? Have you ever done a platformer before you try to do Super Meat Boy? Because if you do, then you probably know enough of the genre and the difficulties and the design pieces so that you can start changing things in an efficient manner without relying on, without needing like months and months and months to iterate. If you have that time at hand, it's fine. Just remember that every month that you add to development, you have to sell a little bit more to pay for your development time, right? So this is just a caveat, just something to pay attention to, but it's definitely possible to pull this one off. Now, best art in small arena. This is kind of similar to best art in genre, but way easier to pull off. What is it? It's having really good graphics for the graphic paradigm that you choose to tackle in an arena that you are deliberate about choosing. So there's a bunch of ways to pull this one off. So let's talk about the principle that guides this. This is basically a hack, right? Because you are trying to you are picking a parameter to be compared against, and you are being deliberate about that. You are choosing that in a way where you can over deliver, right? So you can choose a small arena where people are use it to some sort of style, and then you can make the best freaking looking game ever in that very specific style. This is one way to pull this off, right? Best art in genre, but it's a best art in a small genre or in a small arena because you are creating a comparison parameter. So you choose what you are compared against. You can have this magnet for certain audiences or venues. So maybe you can have a game that looks like a game that could be either on Steam or on casual portals, for example. And if you have a way to communicate with people in that casual portal, and they are used to lower graphic standards, for those people, you have the best art in that small arena of casual games that look like that. Even if you are also selling on Steam, and maybe there you don't have that magnet, but depending on how you position your marketing, you can even do both things, right? You can choose what you're compared against, and depending on the audience, you can be the best art in the small arena or not. So let's get more specific with some examples. Geometry Wars, right? Probably the best asteroids game ever made, the best looking asteroids game ever made. And notice how when you when you over deliver on polish, when people use those quick cues that the brain used to figure out things about games without taking a lot of time to test those games and to research, when you just look at this game in movement, we just assume that the gameplay must be good and that the progression must make sense and that the game must be overall a really good game. Because if the developers were capable of making a screen that looks like this and it looks polished and looks awesome, then probably they are also good and they also figure out the rest properly, right? Gameplay and the pacing and all that. So we use cues to figure out if a game is good or not. And because this over delivers on polish using a paradigm where they can clearly over deliver, then they get all this advantage too, right? Nidhogg, this is a great example. This is probably one of the best looking Atari games ever made, right? And I would say it kind of fits more in the Brave New Art magnet because Atari is pretty much unusual. Like we don't see many indies trying to replicate that, coupled with other strong magnets that will make their games be known to a sufficiently big audience for it to become, commonplace. We don't know enough Atari-looking games. Nidhogg is one of the few ones that really manages to over-deliver in that style and get known for that visual, those aesthetics. And remember once again that the brain uses cues, right? This is probably a very good Atari game. It's probably a good game. So, right, it's very good for an Atari game, then it's probably a very good game. And probably because it looks like the best Atari game ever made, I would bet that the gameplay is also good in the controls. And even if it had a story, I would probably bet that the story is pretty good too, right? Because you are over delivering, so people will assume that you will over deliver in all those other things that they cannot perceive at the game surface when they are just looking at the trailer or a GIF or other marketing material or some YouTuber playing it. The brain uses cues to take complex decisions. So Nidhogg is a prime example of that, right? Setting the bar really low and then jumping way above that bar, right? And finally, one of my favorite ones, because this one is also almost a hack. It is the Bojack head. We sometimes say game X but better, game X but worse. This is game X but horse. It's when you include the deliberately bizarre elements, usually as being part of your characters, and that makes your game's promotion stand out and stick. It makes it memorable, right? And there's a similitude to landmark of marketing for art in general or specific visual elements. Whereas the Bojack head is how to implement that with characters or with aspects of how you work your art, right? So let's talk a few examples. Of course, BoJack Horseman is the show that originated the name of this particular magnet. And it is interesting, it's an interesting case study because that show could actually work without animals. If all of the characters were humans and it was even like a live action TV series, it would probably still work, right? I can totally see that working as Two and a Half Men, for example. It would totally work. But instead, they decided that they would replace like 50% of the characters or more by animals. And not really animals, but just regular people that have animal heads. And this makes the game stand out so much when you are looking at other shows. You have like that horse-headed man, wearing a suit. And the name of the thing is Horseman, right? BoJack Horseman. So it draws attention to a very weird thing. And sometimes games can also use that. And we'll talk about a bunch of examples. But notice how, before we stop talking about BoJack Horseman, take into account that this series, it actually treats the promise that they make when they have animals featured as part of their world and the thing that they are offering you as entertainment. Because it's not just that they replaced most characters by animals. And honestly, I don't know the backstory of that production, if the original script already had animals or not. I'm just saying that it could work without the animals. But in having those animals there, they also treat it by making sure that some of the characters sometimes do a stupid thing that has to do with the animal that they are, right? So for example, someone slams a door and two characters who are actually pigeons in suits, they are scared and they fly out of the screen. And it's a very quick scene, but it's funny and very silly as you would expect from a series that has those visuals. And it's treating that. So every episode will have one or two or three little jokes that are about that. And that's pretty much it. All the rest is pretty much human drama and human comedy. But it's treating the fact that it's promising a thing that has to do with those animals, right? So it doesn't even need to be it doesn't need to be like in a barn to have animals. They kind of add that, and actually what makes this strange is that they are taking those animals out of context and creating a completely weird looking thing, right? And they are treating that. Now look at Hotline Miami, because it uses literal animal heads in its promotion, right? And it draws attention. The game could be, from a gameplay standpoint, from a game design standpoint, it would totally make sense without those weird looking masks. But because it has those masks, it's easier to promote because it draws attention. Even in the game, this is irrelevant most of the time. It's not important at all. Those masks, they could be anything else, right? Or they could even not exist and the game would still stand. Now, because they have that, it's easier to draw attention. When you see a poster for that game, it immediately draws attention because it looks strange. So that's a literal implementation of a BoJack head. Also, Night in the Woods. Notice how the characters look. It's not because they are animals that I chose this example, but just because look at the size of the eyes, and they are kind of ugly. Their faces are kind of ugly. I have seen probably more well-balanced proportions for faces, but this is very stylized. It kind of reminds me of The Legend of Zelda: The Wind Waker. So we have this very extreme face design. and it draws attention as well, not only for the general art, but also because the characters have this very peculiar look, those huge eyes, so this draws attention. Hateful Boyfriend, dating simulator that actually replaced people by pigeons, right? This has to draw attention, right? Don't Starve, more similar to the Night in the Woods example, in the sense that probably you guys have noticed how ugly the main character is. What's going on with that hair, and all the other characters, they are kind of ugly too. But this guy who's prominently featured in all promotional material, it just looks ugly. But the game doesn't look ugly, and the overall aesthetics of the game are really good. But the fact that it's strange to the point of drawing attention, it's actually a marketing attention magnet. It's actually an art attention magnet, so it helps with selling the game, right? The Binding of Isaac, once again, it's a festival of weirdness, right? The characters, and it's all kind of disgusting, and the monsters and the bosses and where the thing takes place, it all kind of looks a little bit disgusting, like a kid's nightmare, like pretty much Freudian nightmare stuff. And this obviously draws attention, right? It would be totally possible to make this game without such a weird skin to it, but because it has that skin, it draws attention, right? So as long as it fits with the rest of the products and what it promises for the players, it can even help, right? So this is the case of the Binding of Isaac. And finally, a couple more different examples. Majora's Mask, the moon with that weird face going on, is also a landmark of marketing, but it's also like a character, right? It's part of what is happening to the world in that game. And even if it's not visually prevalent in the game, you are not looking at that moon with that face all the time. Most of the time, you're just seeing Link running on grassy fields like you would expect from any Legend of Zelda games. But the moon is still there, and it's still treated, it's still relevant for the game. It's still treated as an important subject for the game. So it totally justifies having that really ugly character that is a moon with a ugly smile, or it totally justifies that because it treats the thing. And PUBG, finally, for a more exotic example of how they implement that, because this is basically just smart promotional art. What is this dude that looks like he just left his job and is wearing a mask and preparing for battle? What's going on with this guy? This scene is just weird. It's just so weird. It draws attention because it doesn't make a lot of sense. We want to know what's going on. This dude should be working probably in an office. What he's doing in this place with this gun on his hand instead, right? It just doesn't make sense, so it draws attention. And of course, there are elements within the game that will justify this being the poster. But honestly, this is not prevalent in the game at all. The game could totally live without that, but they found a way to create promotional art that draws attention by being weird. So what we call the BoJack hat, without having to change the whole game to do that, right? So this is an example. And this is pretty much a hack, or this can be a hack, because this can be retrofit in an existing game, right? So you can just add that element. You can just change a few things about your game so that it starts drawing attention for that characteristic alone. Actually, I mentioned before when I was talking about Night in the Woods, I mentioned The Legend of Zelda, The Wind Waker, and I would definitely cite that as an example as well. Now, I remember that not all fans of the series liked Nintendo's approach for these games' graphics, but yet it drew attention. It's different. It draws attention, gets people talking, right? And this is about the style, but it can also work in more superficial things, as in the case of PUBG or as in the case of Majora's Mask. This can totally be retrofit. Just make sure that you are treating the subject, the weird element that you are adding to draw attention. Make sure you are treating that with your design, that you are polishing it so that it belongs to the game, that it makes sense, it feels natural in the game, and you are good to go. But yeah, this can definitely be one hell of a hack, especially if you have been working on a project for a while and there are a bunch of things that you cannot change anymore to add magnets. This is one that can be kind of cheap, can be one way to make sure that your game surface makes sense. So that's it for the art attention magnets.